Hey gang, welcome to part 2 of chapter 18. This is our penultimate chapter, meaning what? There's only one chapter left. The semester's almost over, and maybe about the time it's over, we sprung from our cages. Hopefully not too quickly though, right? So let's be careful if and when society starts opening up again. Let's make sure this wave doesn't come back to bite us, okay? I'm actually saying that there will be another wave, and it probably will be worse in the areas not hit hard the first time. Here we are in Western New York, right? So be careful out there, right? I put this slide up. We've already seen it back in the first part of this lecture, which is to show the kind of the topographical diversity of the continent of Africa. Essentially, we look to Africa as a separate continent. Geographers give us that framework. Really, Africa, Europe, and Asia are connected, right? It's the Eurasian, right, continent. So we look to really the Eastern Hemisphere. At any rate, here we go with the contours of Africa. We've already looked at Africa in this region, the West. Okay, the kingdoms of Ghana, Mali, later on Songhai, trade coming across the desert by Berber merchants bringing in salt and taking out gold, and small numbers of human beings, slaves, elephant tusks, unfortunately as well. Right? That trade will actually be subverted eventually by the Portuguese, who start bumping down the coast in the early 1400s, okay, and taking large numbers of human beings and a whole lot more gold. Not so sure about the ivory tusks, but taking those back to Europe and eventually right across the Atlantic. That is another course, by the way, which I hope to do person to person, face to face, on campus in the fall of 2020. So if you're looking for a course, you want to see how this one ends up, meaning how world history plays out post 1500. It's called History 1520. If you can stand me, sign up. I'm also doing U.S. history, early U.S. history, from the pre-colonial era up to and including the Civil War. So a little advertisement there. Right? So Africa, we looked at the Swahili city-states here along the East Coast. Look at the proximity to Arabia, right? So seaborne trade, Arab, Muslim traders, city-states here, Kilwa and others. Now we're going to move inland a bit into this highlands region of Ethiopia, where Christianity had taken root probably in the first century of the Common Era. 1900 years ago, maybe almost 2,000 years ago. How could that have happened? Well, now that I don't have my map anymore, North Africa was part of the Roman Empire. So in the first century, North Africa, including Egypt, if we think back to Octavian or Caesar Augustus, conquered North Africa, right? Conquered Egypt from Cleopatra and Mark Antony. It's been a while. Christianity was able to, through the efforts of missionaries, proselytized, right, who spread that young early faith. I would say southward along the Nile. That's technically up the Nile, but we all get confused with that. Southward along the Nile, beyond Egypt, right, into what had been called Nubia, eventually through the Sudan as well, and into what we will now call Ethiopia. So this early Christianity in North Africa was very popular in Egypt and North Africa again. The Christian kingdom of Aksum converted, the monarchy there converted, and again, largely for, it's hard to know what lurks in the hearts of men, right, as the shadow once said, but it certainly benefited rulers to convert to Christianity because it offered literacy. It offered literate officials, and when you're trying to put a government together, how do you do that? A large government without a bureaucracy, you need paperwork in that era, okay? Maybe it was papyrus, I'm not sure. But you need literate people. Merchants and kings, merchants often first because they really need the receipts, right? They really need the pieces of paper. Bible will be translated into local languages. But during the Islamic era, as Islam spread out of Arabia and across North Africa, across the Mediterranean coast of Africa, in many ways the Christian kingdom of East Africa is cut off. It's certainly cut off from developments in Rome or Constantinople. And it kind of develops on its own, right? So when you think of Christianity as a tree that started to split after it became the official religion of Rome in 380, just a century before Rome fell apart, the church starts to split about 480, okay? By the year 500, it's starting to split into a Western, we will call Catholic, and an Eastern, which we will later call Orthodox branches. Well, if I can use a metaphor of a tree, the apple that fell off, the acorn that fell off, and kind of grew up on its own, would be the Coptic, C-O-P-T-I-C Church of Africa. This would include Egypt at the time as well. In the kingdom of Aksum, in Ethiopia, instead of building churches, we'll see in the next chapter how Christians of the 12th century are building these massively tall, delicate, Gothic churches. Think Notre Dame of Paris, which we're now rebuilding because of the fire a year ago. Started in 1163, by the way. In Ethiopia, they're not building churches out of rock, they're carving rocks into churches. Okay, how does that work? Well, I'm not sure if the image here does justice on YouTube, but certainly Google these. There are about 12 of these churches carved out of, each one out of a single rock. So hollowed out rock. There's a long tradition of rock carving in this part of Africa. This is actually a church, so you would actually not necessarily go in it. Very few people would go in it, and that climate doesn't rain enough, right? So people will stand around the church, and it becomes a symbol, right? Also in a cruciform pattern, which is interesting. Shows a great devotion of these Coptic Christians. And also we'll see the political alliance between the ruling family and their version of Christianity. So the Ethiopian Christianity will be isolated from other Christian areas until the 16th century. Well, what's going on in the 1500s? The Portuguese show up. The Portuguese have gone around the bottom of Africa, if you will, up the east coast, and they encounter these Coptic Christians. And you might think like, oh, we've finally found this Christian kingdom in Africa that we've been looking for hundreds of years. And like, no, essentially the Portuguese Catholics said, you Coptics have it all wrong, okay? You walk to church and then you kneel. You don't go to church on your knees, like walk on your knees, right? This monophysitism and things, frankly, we won't get into right now, where Jesus is of one body in the Coptic Church. That doesn't make sense. So the Coptic Christians were not good enough for most of the Portuguese, certainly not the Catholic establishment in the 1500s. Strong African influence. This would be another problem for the Portuguese, that in the Coptic Church there's a belief in the spirit world. Not just the Holy Spirit, but the spirits of deceased ancestors, spirits in nature. Okay, the wearing of amulets, kind of, well, for lack of a better term, good luck charms. Okay, we're seen as pagan, we're seen as non-Christian by the Catholics who eventually show up. Islam and African society, basically, both Islam and Christianity needed to accommodate, right, to African belief systems. We weren't going to change everything within Africa. Islam will certainly take root in East Africa as well. There, as in the West, below the Sahara, ruling elites will accept Islam. Look, again, I don't know what lurked in the hearts of men, but it was good for business. If you're a Muslim merchant coming down the coast of East Africa, and I'm an African business person and I convert to Islam, it's probably better for business, okay? No matter what I really believed. Okay? It was not forced conversion at this time. It's not this kind of convert or die nonsense that you see in Hollywood depictions of Islam. It's just better for business. Or look, certainly maybe some African people saw Islam as the straight path, as the truth, and converted for that reason as well. Okay? Pagan traditions nonetheless were retained. So the rulers of East Africa did not at this time force Islam on their people. People could continue to believe, especially in animistic traditions, spirits in nature, spirits of ancestors. Okay? And I don't mean to denigrate those beliefs. It's just harder to define, right? By definition, it's almost ineffable, right? There's not like a book of animism. Animism was more of a natural, kind of heartfelt belief system. Okay? It's not following the letter of everything in a book dogmatically. Islamic gender norms were apparently slower to penetrate African society, at least according to our textbook. Women who had never been veiled would largely not accept the veil. Okay, it's certainly in certain warmer climates and more humid climates of Africa, yes, the term escapes me now. Sumptuary laws, right? The wearing of certain clothes would just not be acceptable. Doesn't work if someone is out in the field harvesting sorghum or yams or other crops, wearing a veil and another garb maybe didn't make as much practical sense. African societies, cultural development, there would be more trade across the Sahara, okay, and also eastward into the Indian Ocean, okay, from Africa across the ocean to India. Arabia there is kind of in the middle. Africa will eventually replace Eastern Europe as the principal source of enslaved people. Okay. So I think we had said before that the term for slave comes from the ethnic term for Slav, which was the ethnic language and groupings of much of Eastern Europe, where people have been enslaved. Think north of Greece, for example. But increasingly, slavery came to be equated with skin tone, largely because, again, I talked about this last time, perverted as it is, as perverse as it seems. If a wealthy European family had an enslaved person who was a different skin color, different phenotype, looked different, right, than your more common Slavic slave, that meant that person came from further afield and cost more. So you would be wealthier if you had an enslaved person who was of a different ethnicity, who came from far away because it was harder to get. That person was more rare. Okay, it's really difficult for me, obviously, to think in terms of commodities. Right, people as commodities is just a really bizarre way of thinking, but not so among at least many Europeans and I'll call them Middle Easterners at this time. There's also slavery within Africa. Yes, within most societies there's been slavery throughout history, early history, pre-modern history. Prisoners of war, instead of being killed, could be enslaved. But it was never, almost never, okay, perpetual. It was never hereditary. Your parents are slaves, so you're a slave, your children are slaves. That comes later with transatlantic slavery. The racism will be invented later with transatlantic slavery. The brutal and dehumanizing conditions of the Middle Passage and slavery in the Americas will require a denigration of humanity that will be justified by racism. Well, those slaves aren't really people anyway. They're less than human. They're less than I. They're the children of Ham. There'll be all these kind of biblical justifications that, out of context, seem to make sense to the people spouting them, but in reality, the spirit of any religion certainly do not. Okay, so there would be, small-scale warfare between African societies and the taking of prisoners of war, slaves. Right, but the Europeans are going to blow that up, meaning they're going to significantly exacerbate or make that worse. Okay. Within African society, people will continue to be related on a small scale by kin. That's redundant. On a small scale society, people tended to be related. Okay? Gender relations, we do begin to see more male dominance coming into play, but still those age grade systems whereby the people you grew up with become part of your cohort, and there's a lot of peer pressure to conform to the expectations of the class of 2020, okay, of your age grade. Here again, slavery again. Most were prisoners of war. Maybe you fell into debt. Maybe I fell into debt. I owe you $10,000. I can't pay it off, so now I need to work for you for 10 years with no pay. Doesn't mean my kids are going to be enslaved. It might mean that I'm your history professor for 10 years. God help me, right? Doesn't mean I'm picking cotton, right? Hardly anyone was picking cotton at this time, at least in West Africa. Maybe someone's accused of witchcraft. Well, we'll enslave that person, right? Criminals, instead of going to some type of incarceration, they're enslaved for a number of years. Okay? Mostly for agricultural labor, but keep in mind that the pictures you have of slaves picking cotton, that's really early 19th century United States. Right, so here we end chapter 18. One more to go. We're going to turn our attention back to Europe during the high, meaning the middle medieval period, high Middle Ages, and then the late Middle Ages. Okay? I'm going to try to squeeze in a video right now. I'm just looking at my time. Might not get through all of this here. I'll post the link anyway. But here's a look at Ethiopia in the 1100s.
While churches rose to the sky in Europe, in 12th century Africa, they were being carved out of the ground. These Christian pilgrims in Ethiopia are on their way to worship at one of them. In these highlands, in the 12th century, Lalibela, a new king from a new dynasty, built a new holy capital. Today, Lalibela's legacy lives on. In the physical splendor of the churches and the traditions of their guardian priests.
My
blessed people and congregation, churches with no mud, no wood, and no cement. You cannot find anything like this in the rest of the world. You are all blessed because you are here. This place was built by God.
Every year on St. George's Day, pilgrims gather to celebrate a faith that has endured here for 16 centuries. These Christians claimed that God brought the Ark of the Covenant and the tablets of the Ten Commandments to their land. On holy days today, priests carry on their heads replicas of the tablets, wrapped in gilded cloth. The people of Ethiopia have been carving churches out of mountains for more than 1,000 years. But the 11 churches of Lalibela symbolize their achievement to the outside world. The king has become a legend, his story told by monks even today.
There was a city called Roha, where lived a man who belonged to one of the most noble of families, one of the richest in gold, silver, garments, precious stones, servants and maids. He had a child who became the mysteriously named Lalibela.
In the legend, the king's greatness was recognized at birth. A swarm of bees descended on his cot as if around honey.
His mother named him Lalibela, which means the bee has recognized him as king. But these were not bodily bees, but angels who took bee form in order to announce his reign.
God sent one of his angels to bring Lalibela to heaven, to show him the most holy of churches. Lalibela, the story goes, ordered tools to be made to carve temples like those he'd seen in heaven.